So today I'll be talking about UX research and self-care. So thank you all for joining to learn a little bit more about this topic. So a little bit about me. I was born in Peru, and Spanish is mi primera lengua. I'm a senior UX researcher at RSM, which is it's a finance company, but I'm within their consultancy branch. And so that means I talk to a lot of people. I learned about their experiences, and I share that with my clients to improve their products, the websites, and processes. So I also support the ResearchOps Community as part of their board, and I am also behind the UX Cafecito. So I run that and have really great facilitators that help me keep this on so that we can do things like this presentation today. If you're interested in presenting at the UX Cafecito, feel free to reach out. And, thanks to, since starting my career, I've had the chance to work at different types of companies, and different types of teams. So this has kind of given me a chance to look at how different teams work and function according to their UX maturity. So early on, because of this, ethics was something that caught my eye. And today I'll just barely scratch the surface by talking about self-care, and it'll even be even more specific than just the broad topic of self-care, because I'll be talking about preventative self-care. So before I get started, I just wanted to give a kind of like a content warning, because I will be sharing some personal anecdotes that could be a little bit hard to hear. They'll talk about mental health, medical issues. So I won't go into detail, but if you don't feel up to it, feel free to, you can drop out and you can revisit the recording. It'll go up. That's no problem at all. Before I start an anecdote, if you don't want to hear it, I can, I'll go ahead and let you know I'm going to a story. So, and then before we actually get into it, if you're still here, I want to go through a little exercise to prep us to kind of hear those hard things during this talk. So we're going to do a quick breathing exercise together. And you're welcome to turn off your camera if you don't want people to see you doing this, that's fine. So we'll start by taking a deep breath, but you'll be expanding your belly as you breathe in. You hold it in for 2 seconds and then relax your belly as you let it out. So you want to keep breathing like this as we go through, expanding your belly as you breathe in, letting it go as you breathe out. And as you're doing that, I'll pose some questions for you to kind of think through. So first one, and just think through them. You don't have to say them out loud. You can if you want, since we're all muted. But the first question is, how am I feeling right now? So take in how you're feeling right now. What is something that brought you joy recently? And think about, why was that? Why did it bring you joy? And finally, what can you commit to do later today to bring yourself joy? And this can be anything. It can be as small as eating a piece of chocolate, as taking a walk with your dog. It could be anything, as long as it brings you joy. And again, take a really deep breath through your belly and then let it out. Cool. All right. So I hope that kind of that help you prep a little bit. I know it definitely helped me. So let's start by talking about what self-care is. There's a lot of definitions of what self-care is. This is the primary definition from the International Self-Care Foundation, that they use. And as you can see, the concept of self-care is really broad, and it encompasses everything from hygiene to what you put in your body and to your environment and your social circumstances. So there's so many things that contribute to maintaining your health and well-being. And over the years, I've heard a lot of advice for self-care. So this is what you see here, some of the traditional guidance for self-care, be it from article, friends, family, or even companies that I've worked at. I've seen this in all sorts of ways, and this doesn't scratch the surface. It's just an examples of a few of the tips that you get. And while this is all great, and I encourage you to do these things, these tips, if you take a look at them, they kind of put the burden on what you should do by yourself or even after something happens. And that's usually after work. So my talk today focuses on what you can do at work. Having said that, at the end of my talk, I will also share some resources. I'll provide a link where you can get some of those that go to some mental wellness resources and other references that I use throughout. There will be a link there. There will be a QR code and a link. And let me get a little bit into why I'm talking about this. I'm going to share a bit of a story here. So story coming. So you're probably wondering, like, what does self-care have to do with research, right? And not just about as far as, caring for participants, but this is self-care as a researcher. So when I graduated my UX school, I got a job at a health insurance company. And I took, many precautions when planning research, but sometimes that just wasn't enough. And as a fresh graduate, I didn't know all of the things that I needed to know. Because also there just wasn't a senior researcher on my team. I was actually the only one with a previous training. So I didn't have somebody to provide me that guidance. And one day I had a really heart-wrenching experience while conducting a research session. And a participant actually broke down crying. And you're probably wondering, like, what did she do to make this person cry? But the thing is that research sessions can get so emotional that even if the topic isn't, you don't know what a participant's going through or what they could end up telling you, what something could have reminded them of. That's a traumatic experience. Sometimes people just want somebody to talk to, and you are right there. So you hear intimate details of their life that you weren't trying to pry into. And in this case, I listened, I didn't rush them, and I let them tell me what they wanted to do next. So we actually did continue with the session because they wanted to stay on there and finish it. So the rest of the session went well. And things ended on a good note. However, at the end of it, I wasn't okay. And that's kind of where I had an epiphany. I hadn't prepared for the things that I heard in that session, and I took them home with me. And this is, like I said, the epiphany is kind of what made me realize that we really need to make sure we conduct research both ethically and safely for everyone that's involved in that process. And since then, I've really, cared about this topic a lot. I realized that how important it is that self-care starts with planning your studies properly and having the right support systems in place. We had no processes in place to help me when that happened that day. I just, I went home and I dealt with it. But that day, what I actually heard, and this is a little bit, personal, but I'm going to share with you to kind of give you a context of just how this kind of thing can affect people, is I heard a diagnosis from a participant that I also had that actually almost killed me. So I have had a lot of health issues in my life. And that's kind of like a way for you to resurface things, dredge up trauma that you may have had. And so that happened for me. And I took care of my participants, but then who takes care of me? And you could tell me, you can go to therapy, you can do all these things, but that's after the fact. So what do we do to kind of prep ourselves going into a session when we don't know? Like, it seemed okay, so nobody batted an eye. They thought Brenda is cool. They have no idea because you don't talk about these things at work. As researchers, our job is to listen and empathize with our participants. But when you hear something traumatic in the session, it adds up over time. All those things that you hear. And this can happen in any type of industry. Just because you don't discuss delicate topics or talk to vulnerable populations doesn't mean that you won't run into this. And ignoring it in the long run will only result in compassion fatigue. Now, what is compassion fatigue? So the WebMD says that compassion fatigue is the physical, emotional, and psychological impact of helping others, often through experiences of stress or trauma. It goes by many names. There is secondary traumatic stress, secondary stress reaction, and vicarious trauma. This type of stress is caused by repeated exposure to other people's trauma. And, this can very well happen in research sessions. This either happens by directly seeing it or hearing them. So yeah, you can hear trauma and get traumatized by it, depending on how much you hear. And this is not new. This is something that professions like therapists, first responders, social workers deal with constantly. They hear about all sorts of things, and this affects them. However, it's not been until the last few years, which coincide kind of with the COVID pandemic, that we started really caring about mental health more. I've heard others talk about the effects that user research has on researchers themselves since then, but still not as much. And it's been a whole year since I first did this presentation. I wish it was talked about a bit more. So here's some other definitions that I just want to bring up as well, because they can get a bit confused with compassion fatigue, also because there's a little bit of overlap. So the first one is emotional labor, and it probably sounds similar, but and familiar, I'm sure. But this is not about empathy, but about performing with your emotions as expected by society. You could very well get, some have emotional labor from doing research, but emotional labor, it's something that it gets tiring. A large majority of us do it because we interact with people constantly as part of a job. So anyone could end up having that. And a lot of us are probably familiar with burnout here. When you reach that point of exhaustion, that because you left your stress untreated for so long. So, and I mentioned that there's a little bit of overlap. This is kind of how they interact here. Made a little visual for you, and like they're not the same, but they're also not mutually exclusive. And you can unfortunately experience all of these things. And that sucks, but and if you leave it untreated, as I mentioned, it can have a big impact. I compile a list of some of the symptoms that you can experience here, and you can see as a result of compassion fatigue. And this is, again, not an exhaustive list. I have some links at the bottom as references. I'll share these at the end of the talk. But, addressing it and not addressing could really impact your personal life and even your ability to do your work over time. So, as you can see, taking action's really important. You gotta take care of yourself. And here's some pictures of ducks, just because I like taking a picture of ducks. So my next thing is, what does research look like at your organization? I think we gotta start there, because gotta think about where things start. It's not just at your planning a project, right? But when you start a new research project, for example, you're thinking about your processes. Do you start from scratch? Like you could recreate the wheel every time, or do you spend time searching for old studies? Do you have a system in place where you have your approaches documented? Because before you start adding new processes and activities, You need to know what you're doing, what you're working with. You may not be able to implement changes that consider self-care quite effectively if you don't have a good process right now. So that's something that I just want to bring up. And another key question is like, when was the last time that your team evaluated the way that you plan and conduct research? So you don't know where you're at or what you're doing. Maybe it's a good time to evaluate that. And even if you don't have established processes, you should continue to evaluate and update those. Even if you have established processes. And because you need a baseline so you can learn new things and make changes as you progress. And that's so that you have something to compare against as you continue to grow and implement self-care practices. So once you have that, you can start defining your process for anticipating this compassion fatigue and make a plan for that. And once you have that, you can start thinking about things like this question, like how will you actually handle the emotional, tense, or even dangerous situations that may come up during research? So is there a chance that you could end up talking about delicate subjects? Do you have a plan for when those come up? If you don't expect, even if you don't expect them to, and what if it actually becomes dangerous, right? So I have a little quadrant here now to show, because you can't plan for everything, but you can start creating your own playbook. And it comes back to 4 different questions. It's the basic four questions: what, who, when, and how. If you start thinking about those for stressful situations, you can build some procedures and guidelines. Yes, it won't be exhaustive, but you can start to think through about how does your team work, how do they interact, and how do I address a situation as it arises. Because self-care is only a part of this. There could be a situation where you're in danger and you don't know what to do or how to get your team member out of there, and that's part of self-care. You got to make sure that you're safe when you go into those sessions, because conducting research ethically not only protects the participants, but the people doing the research. And there's more than just you. There's a whole team behind you, and people that you interact with, people that interact throughout the entirety of the research process that may be exposed to these sessions as well. And if you're not prepared, if they're not prepared, they very well may affect them as well. Your team, your organization, if you have your clients that are watching sessions, people that are observing the sessions, taking notes, watching the recordings, even reading the transcripts, they can all be affected. It can just trickle throughout. So we all bring different sets of experiences with us, and wherever we go, and we take in everything in so differently that we just going in unprepared is can be considered a little bit dangerous. But your company has a role in this too, wherever it is that you're doing that research. They play a role in how you actually implement self-care. Because they should be part of your support system there at work. So you gotta, when you're trying to think about how to consider mental wellness and self-care in your studies, you gotta think about what support systems you have at work. They may already offer mental wellness resources and programs. They might have employee resource groups. These communities often have shared experiences that tie them together, and because of that, their resources may be more specific to those that have shared experiences. So having that support for anyone in your team to have that's also pretty important. Your one-on-ones are also a great time to discuss gaps in self-care in the research process and at work in general. Of course, that depends as well what your relationship is with your manager. The other part is having people in place to support you. And that's both having people focus on research operations and leadership that will champion your efforts. There's a lot of resources available to help us plan and deal with stressful situations. And, having the support from your company, having them champion you so you can make those changes is pretty important, because you can't do it alone. So I want to go into my next story here. That's also a little delicate, but one of stressful situations, last year, I conducted a study with cancer patients. So I visited a few oncology clinics over the course of 5 days, talked to a lot of people. They shared their experiences with me. And at times it got pretty emotional because, cancer makes everything very emotional. While I was preparing for the study, I learned that 1 in 3 people will have cancer in their lifetime. So that means that, there's a high likelihood that everyone on this call knows someone who has had cancer at some point in their lives or even had cancer themselves, because it's that pervasive. So I have known multiple people in my personal life who have had cancer, and I assume that it'd be no different for my team, who I travel with to these client sites. So knowing that, I set out to plan a study that kept my team safe. How can we stay connected and take care of each other as we travel to this, state and different sites that we didn't know before, and make sure that we're okay. So these are some of the things that I did. So the first thing, of course, is that I started a dialogue of self-care with my team. And I revamped the mental wellness resources that I had previously put together for a different study. My goal was to provide these to our participants, but as well as for my team. And I had created these previously because I realized that we had some, some therapy benefit, mental wellness benefit from the company, but nothing that was kind of immediate. Like this is the suicide hotline. This is that. We didn't have anything like that. So I put that together to give participants as well. This is something that has become kind of a staple. I also checked in with each of my team members separately to understand how they were feeling about the trip and what concerns they had, and if there was anything that I needed to do to help them prepare for that. And it was, of course, open to them to tell me whatever they wanted to share with me without any pressure. And, I strongly recommend that you don't try prying into people's personal lives or try to get into their medical history. However, depending on how close you are with them, if they want to share things with you, like that's okay. But also think about that before going in. They may want to share things with you that you may not be prepared to hear, just as with research sessions. So we worked together every step of the way. And eventually I came up with an activity that we were okay with trying out. And, this is kind of like the first step to trying things that we can implement to make sure that we're thinking of things top of mind. So this was the team wellness check. So my goal for this activity was to be as painless as possible and least intrusive as possible, especially because I was also introducing something really new to the team, and I had to get them all on board with it. It couldn't really disrupt, the flow and the study and take too much time, because a lot of people, it's kind of like research, but a lot of people kind of like don't want to really take the time to do the self-care things. So you want to make sure that they will do it, because it doesn't get in the way of them doing work, and it benefits them and they're happy with it. They want to do it. So this is these were like the 4 questions that I asked during the team wellness check. So As far as like the instructions go, I asked people to take a few minutes to write answers to the 4 questions. They could do it mentally, they could choose to write it on their phone, a paper, anything, depending on where we were. We were on the road, so we couldn't really, always have paper out on hand. Somebody might be driving, we might be eating. And it doesn't matter where you're doing it as long as it's private, that you don't tell anyone. And the only rule is that you do not have to share anything about the first 3 questions unless it's part of the last question that you actually want to share that. And, anyone's welcome to share. And it's also okay not to share. But as long as you're thinking about all of those things and taking a moment to check in with yourself, I think that's an important thing. So another thing to consider with this, though, is that if you're implementing something like this, you got to be the person that's going to lead this discussion and be the first one to share. You can't ask people to share if you're not willing to share. So it's something to consider, because showing vulnerability is going to open the door to an honest discussion with your team. And we had some pretty good discussions. We talked about, because we run into moments where people cried or teared up because, again, cancer is, it's a whole thing. And, everyone very likely has had experiences with that. I will not be sharing specifics about my team, but, yeah. And, the goal again of this, of this discussion is to make sure that team members are cognizant of their emotional well-being. Because communication is a powerful thing and it kicks off the processing of events that you heard or witnessed. Sometimes awareness, it's all it takes to get someone into taking action. You have a session, you do this right after. Or, sometimes, but you just got to make sure you get your teams buying to this. This is not meant to replace therapy. So, and also do not try to cancel your team members, please, because that should be left for them to actually pursue somebody in therapy. This is it's more of a sharing session. If people want to share, may not want to share, and that's okay, as long as they kind of have those available to them to kind of think through, stop from just running on to the next session, running on to the next task. That's all it's meant to be for. And as I was starting to say earlier, you can do this every session or once a day. We did it daily because of our schedule and or in between clinics, actually, when we went to multiple clinics in one day. You just gotta find your happy medium, what works for you. And again, this was the first time that I had done it. So, we'll see how we continue doing that. And you're probably wondering, like, this is still something right after it happens. So like, what about wellness checks before a session, right? The activity, but you can do something similar to it before a session. So you're probably familiar with exercises that have you check in about your biases and your assumptions before research. It's pretty similar to that. Before sessions, a lot of teams do this. They'll check in on this, their biases, their assumptions they have about a session, so they don't bring them into a session, right? And because this brings awareness to your own beliefs and help you stay objective. But something that you can expand this with is by thinking about like the mental well-being of your team and yourself. So instead of just thinking about your assumptions, collecting, this is what I think will happen in session, or like, oh, I had this experience and I just don't like this kind of thing. Instead of just focusing on those things and being conscious of those, include as well how you're feeling before a session. Because I think it's important to check in to see if you are in the right state of mind to even conduct a session, be observing that. Sometimes you might find that you're not okay and, you just kept on going and then just harmed yourself by going through things. So there's just three questions here. Like the other exercise, you can ask yourself these privately. These are not for sharing, like the other session. And it's to understand how you're feeling, how what you're doing can affect you, how you can affect others, and how can you even affect the session. Because as I mentioned, you may not want to do the session if you have something really traumatizing, or if you're a bit distraught because you have something going on, you may not want to go in there. Because imagine if you go in a session, you're feeling that way, and something traumatizing happens in that session, that will not pan out well for you or the participant or the people observing that. It could hurt everyone, yourself included. So just something to think about. And you can kind of, I like this exercise because it can help you just analyze yourself in that moment to see where you're at. It's important because if you're not feeling okay, finding a way to make things work, whether that's finding somebody else to take over the role for you or being an extra careful about the way you treat yourself that day, is important because now you know that you're feeling like that. But a lot of us just keep going and keep working because we're supposed to work, we're supposed to produce results, but we don't slow down to think about how that's all affecting us until it's a bit too late and it's 8 p.m. at your house or your apartment, wherever you live. And this is these two activities, and even the one that we did earlier, are just examples of mindfulness. I don't know if you've heard of this term before, but it's taking the time to focus on how you're feeling in the moment. It's a reflection, and it's very helpful to kind of take the moment to do that. Again, slow down. If you're already reflecting as a team or trying to find a way to check in with your team, how your team is feeling, opting for frequent bite-sized reflections may just be your best bet if you are not doing that yet. Kind of like to ease it into your processes, introduce it to your team, because doing a whole activity that takes 30 minutes or more is not going to get them on board to do this. Part of taking care of yourself is taking the time to understand how different things affect us throughout the day. When I first started working as a researcher, I didn't realize just how mentally, emotionally, and even physically exhausting it is to do multiple sessions in one day, for example. So I have some do's and don'ts here to help you as well with that self-care. So do schedule breaks, break up your work, sandwich research with non-research tasks. I think a lot of us, when we, at least, well, I'll speak for myself here. When I started, I was taught that, like cram in as many sessions as you can to get the work done quickly and meet your deadline. And that's not gonna turn out well for you. So just don't schedule too many in one day, or schedule them adjacent to each other. You need time to recover, process these sessions, analyze them, have a break, drink some water. Especially in field research, where you may be on the go, it's even more important in those sessions that you take breaks. You may be trying to fit them all in because you're only there for a limited amount of time. Don't cram them in. So think of this as prevention, because if you keep going like that, it's putting yourself in situations that take away your ability to take care of yourself. So, and this is a way to implement self-care. I think there's probably a lot more that you can do if you kind of kick-started with this and come up with your own processes. But, if you're thinking about what do I do now, I just invite you to dive into this topic, research it some more. Or maybe you're not a researcher, but maybe you work with research teams. Even if you don't do research and work with researchers, this translates really well to other fields. We all talk to people. So change isn't likely to happen overnight. So keep that in mind. Just focus on what you can do right now. Start with things that don't disrupt your team's current flow. Like my dad told me, one of the hardest points in my life is that you don't need to climb the whole mountain at once. You can take small steps. And at some point, when you turn around and look back, you'll see that you made a lot of progress and you're almost there. It will take time, effort, and commitment to modify the way that you plan research, that you plan research with self-care in mind. But if you're leading this change, I just want to say, please remember to be really kind to yourself, because it's often the people that take on this kind of work that take on the emotional labor and end up with burnout. So you want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, especially if you're trying to introduce something like this into work, because you will be the go-to person for this. People will want to share things with you. So keep that in mind again. And thank you so much for joining us today. And there's the QR code if you want to open it up. I can actually also share it. There should be a link in there with references. So let me pull up the chat real quick and link it. So should be able to open that up. But I'll stop sharing now.